merchants in America who had plenty of capital and ships at their disposal, but were looking for a way to engage in the China trade so as to bring back the tea, silk, and porcelain that Americans had grown accustomed to and greatly desired. And in 1787, five Boston merchants gathered together and financed a voyage to the Pacific Northwest coast. And one of the ships in that voyage, the Columbia, shown here on the left, became the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe. And when it returned to Boston, it had earned its backers about $25,000, which was enough to garner the attention of other merchants. And soon, the sea otter trade along the Pacific Northwest coast became a virtual American monopoly. But it wound down during the early 1830s because of a problem that is all too common in the history of the fur trade. Man's avarice for furs outstripped the ability of the animals to reproduce. So by the early 1830s, the number of sea otters off the Pacific Northwest coast was vanishingly small. Now, at the same time that the sea otter trade was taking place, the Americans also monopolized the fur seal trade. They would go to rookeries and club the seals to death, strip them of their skins, and sell those skins for $1 to $5 a piece in Canton, China. Now, while the sea otter and the fur seal trade was taking place, the American fur trade headed in a new direction, heading west from the Mississippi all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. On July 4th, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson, shown here in one of his fur-lined coats, electrified the nation with the news that we had purchased from the French the Louisiana Territory, nearly doubling the size of the country and creating what is perhaps the greatest real estate transaction in history. And with that purchase, America's march to the Pacific received an enormous boost. And soon thereafter, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River, over the Continental Divide, down to the mouth of the Columbia River, and then back again. And what a lot of people don't remember or never learned in the first place is that one of the main purposes of this expedition was to scope out the western lands for the possibility of expanding the American fur trade and establishing an outpost at the mouth of the Columbia to serve as a jumping-off point for the expanding China trade. And of course, Lewis and Clark, along their journey, found plenty of fur-bearing animals. And this map, I just wanted to show it quickly. This is the end paper map in the book. And it's a map that I had commissioned by a New York artist. And it basically shows a lot of the trails and pathways and locations that I talk about in the narrative so as to illustrate them. Now, in Lewis and Clark's wake, and the information they brought back about the fur riches out west, many traders and trappers from St. Louis headed out up the Missouri to trade with the Indians and go into the wilderness and trap beaver on their own. But the men from St. Louis weren't the only ones interested in the upper Missouri. John Jacob Astor, who was born in Waldorf, Germany, the son of a butcher, emigrated to the United States in 1784, ending up in New York City. And he originally thought he was going to earn his living by selling instruments that had been produced by one of his brothers who lived in London. And he did sell those, but he quickly became engaged in the fur trade. And by the early 1800s, John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America, in large part because of the fur trade, but also because of his shrewd investments in real estate. At a time when his friends were laughing at him for purchasing swampland in Manhattan, he was the one that was laughing all the way to the bank when later that swampland turned out to be what we now call Times Square. And right before he died, he was interviewed and asked if there would be anything different that he would do in his life, could he live it over again? And his only response was, I would have purchased more land in New York City if I could have. But now, during the early 1800s, Astor's gaze was firmly on the West. His dream was to establish a fur trading empire and to anchor that empire with a fur trading outpost at the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, unfortunately for Astor, his dreams were not realized. The ship he sent out, the Tonkin, shown here, made it around Cape Horn, but when it arrived at Vancouver Island along the Pacific Northwest coast, the captain of the ship, Jonathan Thorne, a former naval lieutenant that Astor had hired and who was really not a nice person at all, disregarded Astor's advice to treat the Indians civilly, and during a particularly contentious bargaining session with one of the local chiefs, Thorne took a didn't like the bargain that the chief was trying to drive, and he took a rolled up sea otter pelt and he slapped the chief across the face. And this precipitated a series of actions that resulted in all of the men on board the Tonkin being killed, save for 5. And one of those men, who was injured, managed to crawl to the hold of the ship and there light 9 tons of gunpowder and blow the ship to smithereens, killing about 200 Indians in the process. Now, the fledgling outpost that Astor's men established at the mouth of the Columbia, which they called Astoria, had a fitful existence during the War of 1812, and at the end of the war was summarily taken over by the British Northwest Fur Company operating out of Canada. After the war, Astor, who still had the deepest pockets of anybody and the most fervent desire to control as much of the fur trade as possible, sent an army of trappers and traders up the Missouri and established more than 20 fur trading outposts. But he wasn't the only one that was looking at this area. In 1822, William Ashley, who would later become a 2-term congressman from the brand new state of Missouri, placed this advertisement in the Missouri Gazette and Public Advertiser, looking for 100 men to go up the Missouri to trap for beaver. He got the 100 men, they went up the Missouri, and had a miserable time during their first 2 years. They were attacked mercilessly by Blackfeet Indians, and a number of them were killed. They had poor trapping, and those furs that they were able to get, some of them ended up at the bottom of the Big Muddy or the Missouri River as a result of accidents. So in 1824, one of Ashley's men took a brigade through the South Pass in the Rocky Mountains into the Green River Valley, and there he found plenty of beaver that had been virtually untapped. And when that information got back to Ashley, he forsook the upper Missouri and started a new era in which men would go into the Rockies and stay there year-round. And every summer they would meet at predetermined locations called rendezvous, where they would trade in their hairy banknotes or beaver pelts in exchange for supplies to stay out in the wilderness for yet another year. And these men became known to their contemporaries and to us as mountain men. And this is sort of the stereotypical image of the mountain men, looking a little bit like Grizzly Adams. But actually a lot of them were clean-shaven. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Robert Redford film Jeremiah Johnson, but if you are, I didn't find many mountain men that were as good-looking as Robert Redford, but I'm sure there were a few. Among the most famous mountain men were Jim Bridger, who is generally regarded as the first white man to have seen the Great Salt Lake, which he originally thought was an arm of the Pacific Ocean. Jim Beckworth, the son of an Irish father and a slave mother, and Jedediah Smith, perhaps one of the most famous of all mountain men. He was the first American to travel through the Southwest all the way to California, the first to travel from Southern California up to the Columbia River, and the first to transit the Sierra Nevada in the Great Basin of Nevada. Now, their harsh lifestyle notwithstanding, 80% of mountain men were married, and 30% of them were married to Indian women in what were called country marriages, in which the trapper would give the father of the bride a couple of $100 worth of trading goods in exchange for the hand of his daughter. And despite the rather cold, mercantile nature of this transaction, many of these marriages were long and loving and produced many children, and better yet, for the trappers, created alliances between them and the tribes that their wives hailed from. Now, these rendezvous could be rather large gatherings. This is a painting by Alfred Jacob Miller of one of the Green River rendezvous in the mid-1830s. And earlier this summer, I went on a 5-week book tour out west. I drove almost 7,000 miles and flew another 3,000. And one day I was at this spot right outside of Pinedale, Wyoming. I gave a talk at the Museum of the Mountain Men. there. And yes, there was an entire museum devoted to mountain men. It's a fascinating place. But this picture gives you an idea of how large these gatherings could become. At times, more than 1,000 people would show up, and they might stay there for as long as a month. Now, the era of the mountain men came to a close in 1840 with the last of the rendezvous. And part of the reason for the end of this era had to do with the rise of the use of silk and nutria fur, a South American rodent, in place of beaver fur for making felt hats. But the real reason the era of the mountain men came to a close was because the mountain men themselves and their Canadian counterparts, who often operated south of the 49th parallel, had done their job too well. The Rockies had been virtually stripped of an economically viable population of beaver. Now, although the time that the mountain men spent on the national stage, about 15 years, was relatively brief, they had an enormous impact on the history of America, mainly in the area of settlement and exploration. The mountain men sent letters back to government officials telling them about the location of Indian tribes and geographic features. And they also took trails that later became the same trails that immigrants would take heading out west to settle the new nation. Now, while the beaver trade was taking place in the Rocky Mountains, the fur trade was continuing elsewhere. There were still plenty of pelts heading down the Missouri to St. Louis. This is a painting by George Caleb Bingham called Fur Trappers on the Missouri. And yes, that is a cat at the front of that canoe. For some reason, there are a lot of cats out west. Keep running across references to them. I'm not sure how they made it there or why they were there, but maybe there's an interesting book in that. And in 1821, the Santa Fe Trail opened for business, and as the trappers and traders of St. Louis heard about the fur riches in the American, or actually the Mexican, Southwest, they headed down the Santa Fe Trail in increasing numbers, and most of them made their headquarters in a small town to the northeast of Santa Fe called Taos. And from there, these Taos trappers spread out throughout the Southwest looking for pelts. The most famous of the Taos trappers was Kit Carson, who later would become a mountain man before heading off on his career as a leader of military expeditions, and then after he died as a star of dime novels and daring do. This is An Angry Buffalo by George Catlin. Now, while the beaver trade in the Rocky Mountains and the desert Southwest and along the Missouri River was winding down, and the Taos trappers and the mountain men faded into the history books, the American fur trade headed in yet another direction. Buffalo robes had been part of the fur trade since the late 1700s, but only a small part. Now they began to take center stage. When the first Europeans arrived in North America, there may have been as many as 30 million buffalo roaming the continent, stretching from the eastern foothills of the Rockies all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean in some instances. But it's a sad and tragic truth that by the end of the 1800s, this mighty monarch of the prairies was on the verge of extinction. And although there are many reasons for this result, among the most significant was the trade in buffalo robes. Buffalo robes were used, as this Currier and Ives print shows, as sleigh blankets, as bed covers, and to line boots. By the end of the War of 1812, the relatively small herds of buffalo east of the Mississippi had been decimated, but there were still plenty of buffalo west of the Mississippi on the Great Plains. And there forts popped up to handle the expanding robe trade and also the continuing trade in other kinds of furs. This is Fort Laramie in Wyoming, another place that I visited earlier this summer, a national park site.